She didn't come for love, not for a home, and certainly not for the future. But one cold evening on the Wyoming border decided everything for her. This is a story about a woman who was used to leaving and about a man who had long stopped expecting anything from anyone. The Wild West promised them no happiness, only winter, silence, and hard work. Sometimes, that's all it takes for a person to stay. Wyoming, 1891. The wagon stopped at the edge of the road, where the wind never asks for permission. The house stood apart, low, darkened by time, a place where no one waits, and therefore no one is disappointed. She stepped down onto the ground carefully, as if afraid she might be sent back. Everything she had fit into a single chest, and the ability to remain silent at the right moment. This house did not call to her, but it did not drive her away either.
The house met her with silence, not a cold one, not a welcoming one, just a silence that had already learned how to exist on its own. She stepped inside carefully, as if the floor might remember her weight and refuse it. One board creaked beneath her boot and then settled, as though it had decided not to make a habit of noticing her. The air smelled of wood, dust, and something older than either. Everything inside was sparse, worn by use rather than neglect. There were no decorations meant to soften the walls, no objects placed for comfort alone. Each thing seemed to know why it was there and asked nothing beyond that purpose. The man carried her trunk in without comment. He set it down against the wall where there was space, not where it might look better. His movements were steady, practiced, shaped by years of doing what needed to be done without ceremony. He did not ask her where she wanted it, and she did not correct him. The trunk remained where he placed it, as final as if it had always belonged there. She stood near the doorway longer than necessary, her hands folded in front of her, listening. The house did not react to her presence. It did not welcome her, but it did not resist her either. That, she realized, might be the closest thing to mercy a place like this could offer. Light from the small windows faded quickly, pulled away by the early winter dusk. Shadows settled into the corners without hurry. The man moved about the room with quiet familiarity, tending to the simple tasks that marked the end of a day. He did not look at her often, and when he did, it was without curiosity, more like acknowledgement, as if she were something newly arrived but not unexpected. She understood then that this was not a house where explanations were required. Words held little value here, unless they served a function. Silence was not something to be filled, but something to be respected. She had learned long ago how to survive by choosing the right moments to speak, and the longer ones to remain quiet. In this place, that skill felt less like a burden and more like a language already understood. When night came, it did so swiftly. Wind rose outside, pressing against the walls, testing their strength. The sound of it moved through the house in low, steady breaths, not violent, but persistent. The roof answered with creaks and groans that spoke of age and endurance rather than weakness. This house had stood through other winters. It did not boast about it. It simply remained. She lay down when the lamp was extinguished, staring up into the darkness. The ceiling above her was uneven, marked by time and repair. She traced its lines with her eyes, letting the quiet settle into her bones. The bed was narrow, the blankets heavy, their weight unfamiliar but grounding. For the first time in longer than she could remember, her thoughts did not race toward escape. She did not measure distances or imagine routes away from this place. Not because fear had loosened its grip, and not because hope had suddenly taken root, but because there was nowhere else to go that night, no road she could walk that would lead to something better by morning. Outside, the wind continued its work, indifferent to her presence. Inside, the house held. And in that holding, thin and unpromising as it was, she allowed herself to remain still. When night came, it did so swiftly. Wind rose outside, pressing against the walls, testing their strength. The sound of it moved through the house in low, steady breaths, not violent but persistent. The roof and morning arrived without words. The door creaked open. Footsteps crossed the floor. Work began. She rose when the sounds told her it was time, not because anyone asked her to. The air inside the house was colder than the night before, sharpened by the coming season. Breath lingered faintly as she moved, pulling on layers that were stiff with use. Outside, the light was thin and pale, already drained of warmth, though the sun had only just climbed above the horizon. She learned by watching, not by asking. She watched how he lifted things only once, never twice, how he paused before beginning a task, as if measuring its cost, how his movements avoided waste. Nothing was rushed, but nothing was delayed. Work unfolded in a steady rhythm that did not bend for comfort. She followed at a distance, repeating what she could. She learned how slowly a body should move in the cold, how strength had to be kept rather than spent. She learned where to place her weight, how to brace against the wind, how to let silence remain unbroken. Questions formed in her mind and dissolved before reaching her mouth. She already knew the answers would change nothing. Winter announced itself quietly. It lived in the sharpness of the air, in the way the daylight thinned by afternoon, in how quickly shadows lengthened across the ground. The house showed its age in small ways, a loose board here, a gap that invited the wind there. It was not failing, but it demanded attention. It expected care, not optimism. The land surrounding the house felt heavier with each passing day. The soil resisted more. The animals moved slower. Everything seemed to conserve itself, as if preparing for a long test. She understood that patience here was not a virtue, but a requirement. The land did not respond to effort alone. It responded to endurance. At times she found herself listening not to him, but to the house itself, to the way the walls answered the wind, to the roof as it shifted and settled, to the sounds that spoke of strain and those that spoke of strength. She measured these things quietly, as if the house were something alive that needed to be understood before it could be trusted. He worked near her, but never close enough to touch. He did not step away either. Their distance remained consistent, deliberate, not a barrier, not an invitation, something learned long ago and practiced without thought. The space between them felt shaped by experience rather than fear. As the day wore on, fatigue settled into her muscles in a way that felt honest. There was no performance in the labor, no need to prove anything. Tasks were done because they needed doing. When one ended, another waited. She felt the slow ache of effort and recognized it as something she could live with. By late afternoon, the light had already begun to fade. The cold pressed closer, less patient now. She moved inside again, hands stiff, shoulders tight, carrying the quiet weight of the day with her. Nothing had been said that needed remembering. Nothing had been promised. Yet, as she paused near the doorway, listening to the familiar sounds of the house settling around her, she understood something without naming it. This place did not demand more than she could give, and for now that was enough. Swirled with creaks and groans that spoke of age and endurance rather than weakness. This house had stood through other winters. It did not boast about it. It simply remained. She lay down when the lamp was extinguished, staring up into the darkness. The ceiling above her was uneven, marked by time and repair. She traced its lines with her eyes, letting the quiet settle into her bones. The bed was narrow, the blankets heavy, their weight unfamiliar but grounding. For the first time in longer than she could remember, her thoughts did not race toward escape. She did not measure distances or imagine routes away from this place. Not because fear had loosened its grip, and not because hope had suddenly taken root, but because there was nowhere else to go that night. No road she could walk that would lead to something better by morning. Outside, the wind continued its work, indifferent to her presence. Inside, the house held. And in that holding, thin and unpromising as it was, she allowed herself to remain still. Snow fell during the night, quietly and without warning. It did not announce itself with wind or sound. It simply arrived, layer by layer, settling over the land as if it had always been meant to be there. By morning, the world outside the house had changed its shape and its rules. Distances shrank. The horizon felt closer, heavier. Familiar ground disappeared beneath a thin, deceptive cover that made every surface uncertain. The path she had walked the day before no longer revealed itself clearly. What had once been open now required caution. Each step demanded attention. Each movement carried weight. Leaving the house was no longer an act of habit, but a decision that required purpose. The air bit deeper into her lungs than before. Cold pressed inward, not sharp enough to shock, but steady enough to remain. It settled in her chest and stayed there, quiet and persistent. She noticed it when she inhaled, when she paused, when she stood still too long. She said nothing. She adjusted instead. She worked more slowly. Her hands lingered a moment longer on familiar tasks. She stopped more often, standing still not out of rest but necessity, learning how to stretch limited strength across a longer day. The snow demanded patience. The cold punished waste. She learned quickly that speed was no longer useful. At first, the rhythm of the day remained unchanged. He moved through his work with the same steadiness as before, responding to the land as it required. Snow brought more tasks rather than fewer. Paths needed clearing, doors needed checking. Small, necessary labors multiplied without drawing attention to themselves. She followed where she could, careful not to fall behind, careful not to draw notice to the way her breath shortened when she stopped moving. The cold made itself known in subtle ways. Her fingers stiffened faster, her shoulders tightened, the ache behind her eyes deepened as the day went on. She learned to recognize the limits of her body without acknowledging them aloud. Silence remained her instinct. It had always served her better than explanation. He noticed the change, not because she faltered openly, but because the pattern shifted. A pause lingered longer than before. A movement followed a heartbeat later than expected. The work adjusted itself quietly. The pace slowed, not dramatically, but enough to account for the difference. He took on more without marking the shift as anything unusual. No questions followed. No concern was named. The day continued as if this adjustment had always been part of it. Snow fell again in the afternoon, lighter than the night before, but persistent. It blurred edges and softened sound. The world seemed to draw inward, leaving less space for anything unnecessary. Even time felt altered, moving differently beneath the weight of white silence. When evening came, the cold arrived with it. Darkness settled early, thick and unquestioned. Inside the house, the fire was fed longer than usual, not for comfort alone, but because the temperature required it. Heat gathered slowly, pushing back against the chill that clung to the walls and floor. The flames burned low and steady, their light tracing quiet movement across the room. She sat where warmth could reach her, her body heavy with the effort of the day. Fatigue pressed into her bones, not sharp, but deep. It felt earned rather than punishing. The house creaked softly as it adjusted to the cold, responding to the strain with familiar sounds that spoke of age and endurance. She noticed the blanket before she noticed anything else. It rested closer than it had on previous nights, folded within reach. Its presence was unremarkable, placed without ceremony. Not offered, not explained, simply there, as necessary as the fire, as practical as shutting a door against the wind. She took it without hesitation. The weight settled over her shoulders, grounding her. It was not warmth alone that eased her breathing, but the absence of expectation. Nothing was being asked of her in return. There was no moment to acknowledge, no meaning to attach. The gesture existed for its purpose and nothing beyond that. As the night deepened, the wind moved across the roof, testing it gently, persistently. Snow tapped against the walls, light and insistent. The house answered with quiet sounds of resistance. It had weathered other winters. It did not need reassurance. Lying still, she allowed herself to listen, not for him, but for the space around her, for the rhythm of the fire, for the structure holding against the cold. Understanding came slowly, without clarity or language. Care, in this place, did not arrive dressed as kindness. It did not soften itself into promises. It existed in adjustments made without notice, in labor redistributed without acknowledgement, in warmth provided because cold had arrived, not because someone had asked for it. Outside, snow continued to fall, layering the land in silence. Inside, the house held its shape, and within that holding, she allowed her breathing to steady, accepting that this, too, was a form of being kept. The past returned without warning, as it always did. It did not arrive as memory, but as a tightening beneath her ribs, a restlessness she could not place at first. Then came the fear, unmistakable in its shape, too familiar to be confused with anything else. It was the same fear that had once driven her onto a road without certainty, the same one that had taught her to leave before staying could cost too much. She moved through the house with sudden purpose. The careful slowness that had marked her days disappeared, replaced by efficiency born of habit. Her hands knew what to gather. There was little to take. The trunk was pulled from its place and set near the door, its position altering the room more than its contents ever could. The house, which had begun to feel fixed, shifted back into something temporary. The decision did not feel new. It felt practiced, leaving before the pain could take shape, leaving before attachment hardened into loss. It was a pattern she had relied on long enough to trust its logic without question. Her movements gave her away. The way she avoided the center of the room, the way her eyes no longer rested on the walls but passed over them, already detached, the way her body angled toward the door even when she stood still. She did not speak, but she did not need to. He understood without being told. not because he knew her past, but because he recognized the signs. He had seen the same withdrawal in himself once, long ago. The house had changed for her, not in structure, but in meaning. It was no longer something to be endured. It had become something she intended to escape. Outside, the wind began to rise as the day faded. At first, it moved lightly across the land, stirring snow into shallow drifts. Then it strengthened, pushing harder, stripping sound from the air. The sky lowered, thick and colorless, pressing down on the plains. Snow fell heavier now, not gently, but with intent, driven sideways until direction itself became uncertain. The house answered the weather with low creaks and steady resistance. It was built for this, shaped by years of standing against worse than what approached. The land, too, knew how to wait out a storm. She did not. She finished packing quickly. There was no hesitation, no looking back to measure what she might be leaving behind. The trunk closed with a dull finality. The way of it felt familiar in her hands, as if it belonged to her more than the house ever could. By late afternoon, the wind howled openly. Snow moved in sheets now, erasing edges, swallowing paths. The road disappeared first, then the markers that told distance from direction. Leaving meant stepping into a world without reference. It meant trusting instinct over sight, resolve over reason. She knew what it meant. She understood the risk. She had made similar choices before, though never with winter pressing so close. The knowledge did not stop her. Fear had never done that. Fear had only taught her to move faster. She pulled on her coat, tightened it against her throat. The door resisted when she opened it, pushed back by the wind as if testing her resolve. Cold rushed in immediately, sharp and unyielding. Snow struck her face, blinding, stinging. The world beyond the threshold had already begun to erase itself. She stepped outside anyway. The wind tore at her clothing, clawed at her balance. Snow filled the space around her, collapsing distance into white confusion. The house loomed behind her for a moment, dark and solid against the storm. Then it blurred, its edges dissolving as the snowfall thickened. She did not turn back. Turning back had never been part of the pattern. Leaving was something she did completely or not at all. She moved forward, each step heavy, uncertain, driven more by momentum than direction. Cold pressed deeper now, stealing warmth with practiced efficiency. Her breath came shorter, sharper. The ground beneath her feet shifted, hidden by snow that offered no warning of unevenness. She stumbled once, recovered, forced herself onward. The storm closed around her quickly. Sound vanished first, then shape. The world became movement and resistance, effort without progress. Snow clung to her lashes, blurred her vision. The wind roared without direction, making every step feel like a guess. Still she continued, not because she believed she would reach safety, but because stopping felt worse than failing. Because standing still meant acknowledging the fear she was running from had already won. Behind her, unseen, the house endured the storm. Ahead of her, the land offered no promise. And between those two truths, she walked into the white silence, carrying the weight of a decision she had made long before she understood its cost. The storm erased the road completely. What had once been a line of direction vanished beneath drifting snow, leaving no distinction between path and field. The world narrowed until only cold and breath remained, each one measured and uncertain. He went after her when the wind had already strengthened, when snow no longer fell but moved sideways with intent. The land resisted him immediately. Visibility shrank to a few steps ahead. Sound was swallowed whole. Even his own breathing seemed distant, carried away by the wind before it could settle. At first, there were tracks, faint impressions pressed into the snow, already softening at the edges. He followed them carefully, knowing how quickly they could disappear. Each step required judgment. Too fast, and he would lose them. Too slow, and the storm would finish its work. The tracks led away from the house, uneven, spaced too far apart. They told their own story without words. He followed until they thinned, then vanished altogether, erased by drifting white. Beyond that point, there was only open ground and uncertainty, the kind of silence where a person could disappear without leaving anything behind. He searched anyway. He moved in widening lines, scanning the ground, the air, the shifting shapes that might have been nothing at all. Snow pressed against his face, worked its way into his clothing. Cold crept deeper with every passing minute. The storm offered no guidance. It did not acknowledge effort. It simply continued. Time lost its shape. There was only movement and resistance. Then, near a low rise where the land dipped slightly, he saw something darker than the surrounding white, a shape that did not belong to the storm. She lay where the wind had pushed her down. Snow had gathered against her side, already beginning to claim her. Her body was still, too still. He reached her quickly then, dropping to his knees, brushing snow from her face with hands that felt clumsy inside stiff gloves. When he lifted her, she did not struggle. There was no resistance left in her body, no instinct to pull away. Her weight rested fully against him, heavy and fragile at once. The cold had taken more than warmth. It had taken her strength, her urgency, her fear. He held her close as he turned back toward the house, using his own body to shield her from the worst of the wind. Each step back felt longer than the last. The storm pressed harder, as if resisting their retreat. He did not stop. Stopping was not an option the land would forgive. By the time the house emerged from the white, dark and solid against the storm, his muscles burned and his breath came harsh and uneven. The door resisted when he pushed it open, swollen by cold, but it yielded. Warmth rushed out to meet them, thin but real. Inside, the house closed around them, shutting out the wind. Snow fell from his coat onto the floor, melting into dark patches. He carried her to the fire and laid her down carefully, feeding the flames until they grew strong and steady. Heat returned slowly, inch by inch, as if coaxed back into the room. Life resumed its place gradually. Color returned to her face. Her breathing deepened, no longer shallow and broken. He stayed near, tending the fire, adjusting blankets, making small, necessary movements that required no thought. When she woke, it was to warmth and weight. Firelight flickered softly against the walls. The storm still raged outside, but its sound had dulled, pressed back by thick wood and distance. She did not panic. She did not reach for the door or try to pull away. She lay still, understanding before she fully opened her eyes. She was not alone. She had not been brought back as something lost and returned. She had been kept. The house held them both as the storm continued beyond its walls, indifferent and relentless. Inside, heat gathered and remained. And in that quiet space, between breath and waking, she rested without fear, knowing she had not been sent away.
Spring arrived without announcement, the way all important things did on this land. It did not come with warmth all at once or with clear borders between seasons. It came in small signs that could be missed if one did not look closely. The light lingered a little longer in the evenings. The air lost some of its bite. Snow retreated slowly, leaving behind dark, heavy soil that breathed when the sun touched it. The ground was alive again. Difficult, demanding, but alive. The house had endured the winter without breaking. Its walls still stood firm. Its roof still held. And within it, life continued, altered but intact. She stopped counting the days without noticing when the habit ended. Time no longer pressed against her thoughts or demanded to be measured. Mornings arrived, evenings followed, and she moved between them without marking their passage. The road no longer occupied her mind. It existed somewhere beyond the land, beyond the work, beyond the shape her life had taken. The trunk remained where it had been set, closed and undisturbed, not forgotten, but no longer waiting. Work resumed its steady rhythm as the season changed. The land asked for different things now. Soil needed turning. Repairs left unfinished before winter demanded attention. Animals responded to the shift with renewed movement. He worked as he always had, with consistency and restraint. She worked alongside him, sometimes near enough to share the same space, sometimes at a distance that felt natural rather than deliberate. There were no declarations, no moments set apart to define what was happening between them. Their days unfolded through shared effort and quiet presence. She learned the patterns of his work as he learned the steadiness of her staying. Proximity changed without comment. Distance no longer carried meaning. What grew between them did so without being named. It did not ask for recognition. It did not promise permanence. It existed in the way tasks were divided, in the way space was shared, in the unspoken understanding that neither of them needed to leave.
One morning, as she stood outside with soil clinging to her hands and the sound of wind moving gently across open land, the realization came without force. She was not waiting anymore. Not for permission, not for fear, not for a reason to go. She had stayed, not because she had been held, but because she had chosen not to run. At the same time, without words or reflection, he stopped expecting absence. The quiet readiness for departure that had lived in him for years eased its grip. He no longer measured distance with the assumption of loss. What remained did so naturally, without defense. The house stood between them and the land, weathered but standing. It had not promised shelter beyond what it could give. It had not offered comfort freely. It had endured. And within that endurance, something lasting had taken shape. They did not call it happiness. They did not need to. It was enough that the days continued, that the work was shared, that the road remained unchosen. If this kind of quiet story speaks to you, where devotion is built through endurance and silence carries meaning, consider subscribing to the channel Dust and Devotion Tales. More stories like this are waiting there, told slowly and meant to stay.